will go straight to the discussion since we are now almost at 7:30. And to do so, I would like to invite Uta Bauer to join us. Uta Bauer is founding director of the NTU CCA Singapore and professor, School of Art, Design and Media, NTU Singapore, where she co-chairs the MA in Museum Studies and Curatorial Practice. In 2015, she co-curated with Paul C. Ha the US Pavilion for the 56th Venice Biennale, featuring eminent artist Joan Jonas, and was appointed co-curator of the 17th Istanbul Biennial and curator of the National Pavilion of Singapore, 59th Venice Art Biennial, which will feature Shubhigi Rao, both in 2022. Her recent research focuses are on spaces of the curatorial in Southeast Asia, as well as on the interrelation of climate change and cultural loss. I welcome Uta Bauer also to our discussion. And of course, everybody who is listening and who would like to take part is welcome to pose questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So maybe just to kind of start us off, I thought it's fascinating, that the Biennale de Paris, which is actually founded in 1959 by André Malraux, right, is part of this civil servant class of institutional modernism, right, with André Malraux kind of spearheading it in 1959, and of course, 1961 being the second edition. But I also want to bring another figure into it, who is Pierre Estany, who is also a civil servant, who is also becomes the kind of voice actually of the Nouveau Réaliste, right? And so we have this other channel that is also moving between abstraction and figuration, also through the mediation of another bureaucrat turned curator slash critic. And I think that's really fascinating to just, add that to our space of discussion, that we also have the Nouveau Réaliste circulating in this space. And we have other bureaucrats who are making these decisions about who will enter the space of modernism, especially for the youth, right? Under 90, they had to be under 35 years old in order to be in the Biennale de Paris. So it's also this youth culture, of course, that is being produced.
And I want to reassert the importance of the market throughout, because Rastani is writing the Tuscan collector Panza, and specifically saying, don't buy another Rothko. I mean, forget about it. Buy the Nouveau Realist. They're the hip thing, right? So he's actually in the sales room. I don't know if he gets a cut, but he's definitely in a marketing mood. So this cannot, we can't be too pure about what's going on here. There's actual capital. And that's very mysterious with Sadeghian, because he, again, in perversity and a certain kind of posture that needs to be understood, he refuses to sell things, he gives them away. So he has a strange patronage structure where, you put him up in your garage and he paints the wall crazily overnight, Right. So there's so that Ahmad dedicated painting, is typical. It would be dedicated and just given to him. Who pays for the materials, right? There's a mysterious cultural capital generated by Sadeghian that needs to be distinguished from something like the Nouveau Realists or, Pollock and Rothko, who are entering stable gallery systems and being paid by gallerists to support themselves while they generate work for the market, right? So that's something, we might want to just throw in there.
Yes, but not to move away from your argument, of course, which is that there is this whole field of signifiers around style that implicate both the right and the left in this kind of contested space for hegemony, and that it's around figuration and abstraction where he comes in, Sadaqine comes in as this cipher that is that circulates between them both, which I think is would you say that he is an exceptional case in this situation, or are there others like him?
Oh man, I mean, which aspect could be exceptional? He's clearly a pretty unique character. Mm-hmm. But I would turn to the audience and see if others can speak to his exceptionalism. You know, I mean, these postures of the fakir, these postures of the, you know, the crazy uncle whom everybody adores, but nobody can put up with for more than 2 weeks. You know what I mean? It's like he's performing and inhabiting a character, and I'm not culturally competent to situate that. It probably, according to Dadi and others that I've read, it probably has more to do with the inspired poet in Urdu, right? And you know, the Dastangoy, who will tell a story for 6 hours, right? It probably has more to do with a literary tradition that is somehow transposed. And yeah, that might be common across Cold War. You know, you might find a artists modeling themselves on Camus or Sartre, right, in certain circuits. So that may not be unique. So I'm not sure I'm capable of saying what is unique here. But I'd love to take Uta's take on this, because I was very conscious of sort of expanding the ambit to look at Eastern, you know, Far Eastern, right? I mean, Yoshihara, you know, Bokubi. I mean, I think it's a moment where Iftikhar Dadi's really fruitful phrase of calligraphic modernism could be looked at in a very broad context. So that got me excited, just lobbing that in there. But I don't know if we want to do anything with it.
No, I think thanks so much, Carrie, for this really also inquisitive talk, really looking into stories that are not written, histories that are not written and that are left out. And I think that is something very particular if we look up also institutional roles. I mean, you and Iftikhar are also art historians and looking into also an individual practice of an artist and how does that unfold, being between cultures, but being also people of their time, intellectuals of their time, and reflecting their time. What I think is very interesting, what you also brought in parts, is the role of the institutions, the role of the curatorial ambition in the Cold War. And I think it's very interesting because you're looking east, while, for example, one of my PhD students, Kathleen Dietzig, they're looking west. So they're looking the role of MoMA, I mean, which you know,
sure.
Well. I mean, Bateson and others, like to conquer kind of like Southeast Asia as I would say as a geopolitical kind of like strategic step. And this is where it's very interesting to link what you say also to Naeem's film and his installation and the depicting as an artist of this period through a filmic kind of representation, and also living between the cultures, and like his father living between cultures and histories. And I think it's such a complex time. And to me, it's very peculiar, like this notion, who wants to own politics through culture or culture through politics in the Cold War. And I think for me, it's a very interesting moment because culture played a much more important role, I would say, than today. Today, to me, culture is strongly embedded in a market, while then culture was very strongly embedded in a political ambition and vision. It was inseparable in a way. As I say, Malraux was also Minister of Culture. He was in Cambodia before. And so I think this is, to me, this very interesting kind of link that culture was seen, and you mentioned Documenta, culture was seen as a very strategic, important force that had power. You know?
Yeah, I mean, we could be nostalgic for that. I think we should guard and be aware of our nostalgia for that, because people like us would have had influence. You know what I mean? We need to be a little bit skeptical so that we check our nostalgia for this moment that you're recalling, this moment of power where culture had.
I'm not necessarily nostalgic. I was just done, for example, in Naeem Mamian's film, like to see Rajaratnam introducing also the role of culture. And like, I mean, we had a Ministry of Culture then in Singapore, which in that way, it was so important for this young republic. So, you know, so this is, I'm not nostalgic. I think I'm stunned in a way.
Yeah.
You know, about the role of culture, that it was seen as a natural part, like any other ministry, or like it was part of a strategy. While today it's not so much seen from a nostalgic moment, is much more with retrospective curiosity. You know, like we get reminded that there was a different role. You could also say culture then was instrumentalized, and maybe today is more free. So, you know, one can see it from different perspectives.
Yeah, I think those are great observations. And I'm always encouraging students to look at the org chart, you know, the organizational chart. So in France, the ministry, I could be wrong, but I remember certainly today, most of the funding for cultural exchange coming out of France is funneled through the State Department. It's explicitly diplomatic and political. It's not intended to be ornamental in any way. It's a very frank. Whereas in the US context, there's, you know, constant revelations. Oh my God, the CIA was secretly funding this, right? So in the US, it's staged as a revelation that it's political and staged as part of soft diplomatic, Cold War politics or politics today. Whereas in France, it's like, well, of course. What do you think? This is a State Department funding stream. You know, so I think the org charts can also be interesting in that way. You know, most people, for example, Uta, you've lived this. Most people don't realize that the US Pavilion in Venice Biennale is like privately funded.
Owned.
Right? That's so weird, right?
Privately owned.
And the French, you know, of course it's funded by the State Department. What are you thinking? Right. So these org charts, they're important for us to not be monolithic because they're quite weirdly specific. So one of the reasons that Sadiq Kane first comes to Paris in 1961 is that he has won the national exhibition that Pakistan has newly begun to create a national discourse. I mean, none of these artists are Pakistani because the country hasn't existed until that moment, right? So it's just a fascinating problematic. They have a national exhibition that Sadiq Kane wins, and then he's picked up by the internationalists to come to Paris as kind of like, oh, now that your country has designated you as the best, we want you to have this benefit of coming to Paris, right? So the national and the international are constantly reinforcing each other and constantly in dialogue.
And it's interesting that in these first biennales, there was really a kind of the embassies, right? As you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
There was an official role for the embassies to nominate these artists, right? To be the middle.
To be the curators. Yeah.
Right. And I'm just thinking of that because the same problematic brings us to the Magicien de la Terre of 1989. So I'm fast forwarding to basically the future of this discussion, where you also have Jean-Hubert Martin defending himself for the way in which he chose his artists, right? Who he sent to the field to be his proxies. But you also have in 1989, The Other Story, right? In England, right? The Other Story by Rashida Rain, alongside Magicien de la Terre, dealing with the same kind of problematic of modernism, in which you can only be an artist if you're modern, and you can only be modern if you follow these constraints of what we define as modern, which is a certain stylistic field, So I'm fascinated by your choice of this artist who is really like a third term, so to speak, and that he brings both and that he cannot be reduced to either one of these binary positions, but that same problematic is, reemerges in 89, precisely at the so-called, let's say, end of a certain historiography.
But I think it's also important if you mentioned, and I wanted actually to come to Rashid Areen, who is, of course, also an artist from Pakistan, London-based, and who came a bit later to the map and one of the founders of Third Text, and who really, there was a debate not that long ago, to be nostalgic, between MoMA again and some of the artists in SIMAM, which is the conference of International Museums of Modern Art. And there was a discussion, questions from the audience in the 1998 edition of the SIMAM annual meeting in Barcelona. And some people in the audience, actually in that case, Eric Camara from the Senegal has been asking the panel, why is there not more modern art from Latin America, from Africa, from other parts of the world at MoMA, or like writing this narrative? And then the answer was, you're welcome to visit our museum, but not everybody can be exhibited. And that was in 1998. I think none of the museums like MoMA or Tate or so would dare to say that today. So I think we understand in the meantime that certain movements are not owned by a certain place. There are, like, as Roger Burgel mentioned it in his Documenta 12, the migration of form, Cubism, of course, is already a migration of form and adapted and adjusted. Or if you take Wilfredo Lam, for example, who was also part of the circle around Picasso, and who also only later, I think, was recognized as an Afro-Cuban artist for his contribution to Cubism.
Afro-Cubism, but not allowed to be Chinese. These predications, these predications are something I want us to pay attention to.
Yeah.
They're
it's totally true.
They're so fabulous. They're so fabulous. We can't see the Chinese in Wilfredo Lam.
Yeah.
We just can't. We can't make it out. We can't make it out. But I love all the things you're saying, Uta, and I want to just remind us of the postmodern, which had everything to do with that discourse. So I happen to have the privilege of being a fly on the wall as a lowly employee at MoMA. Yes. And I still have the Xerox of the conversation between the museum director and the chief curator at that time, which was a secret debate guiding, development efforts in the future. Basically, should the modern just close around the modern idea? Of course, we're not getting African work because they're not modern in 1930. Whatever African works are, they're not modern, right? So this kind of stylistic corpus that maybe we now have to close in 1981, we have to just seal it off and say that was wonderful and we're going to be that museum. Or director's position, oh no, we are the moving torpedo of the modern, right? We need to capture work as it emerges because that's our mission. The one closing off is the end of funding, because your board of trustees is not supposed to keep collecting art, right? Obviously they want the constant omnivorous postmodern position because their trustees are going to keep collecting art, right? So that is also in question here. The Cold War presumption of a single style that someone like Restany was contesting. Restany was not saying, hey, let's have pluralism. Why don't you look at some nouveau realism? No, Restany was saying nouveau realism is the thing. Give up all your other allegiances. This is the thing. So the torpedo, the mainstream, the single style that everybody should be pro or con, right? That was beginning to fracture certainly in the 70s in the US. And the fascination with a figure like Sadiq Kane is that he never had a single style. Right. I mean, and so that's part of the tension I wanted to surface, that art history is like, what do we do with this guy? Because we cannot tame his evolution. We can't say, well, this was his blue period. No, this is his figurative period. No, I mean, we cannot get him into our desired art historical sequencing of a single style at a time or whatever, right? So he's almost like pre-postmodern, you know, in the way Richter would say, I'm going to paint photorealist candles and I'm going to make completely abstract works, deal with it, right? And it was a very conscious postmodern procedure. Yeah, Sadiq Kane is just doing it, and he doesn't really, you know, he doesn't see a problem with that. And that is a signal of our problem, you know, as art history.
I mean, I think the other important part is that of borders, not just that of institutions, but that of countries. And artists usually did not, as you say, they didn't respect like borders of being part of this or that, but they also don't accept geopolitical borders. I mean, and I think this is why I think it's so hard sometimes for institutions who get certain mandates that are more bureaucratic, as you say, Noit, to deal with certain artworks, because artists are not necessarily following these categories. The opposite, they're opposing those categories. And I think that is, to me, very interesting, that they often be deliberately in another country and later they get reclaimed through the museums or so, like, because they have to represent something in the history or like correct something in that history. And I think the strategy, Caroline, what you bring up, like also resisting to be pigeonholed by your style or this, like, which is kind of a violation to a certain degree because you cannot be categorized. I think that's very interesting to look this up also, because again, it can be deliberate on the one side for joy of doing something else, or like deliberate resisting to being categorized or put in a drawer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very, I love the epistemic tricks of someone like Finbar, Barry Flood, right? Who's saying, let's look at Picassisme as an Islamic trope. I mean, obviously it's reductive, but, you know, to refuse the idea that Picasso somehow progresses the primitive or progresses, you know, the abstract oriental, and to say instead Picasso is an influence machine. He, you know, he would absorb and transmute what we should understand at root as an Islamic relation to abstraction or something like that. I mean, in other words, I love these art historical moves where you just really try and redirect the westernized narrative. It just feels like fresh air in the brain, you know. So I think that's an interesting trick for us to try on in these Cold War narratives, you know. So it's very hard for me with my limitations to say, oh, let me try and understand Pakistani modernism from the inside. That's why I'm so dependent on these diplomats, these translator figures like Waliullah. I think he's super interesting, right? And I'm hoping Naeem will, you know, take him on and make a whole project. Or, you know, maybe Walid, he's like a figure for Walid Rahad, you know. Waliullah,
I don't know if
consummate translator.
Excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if Simone Ville is with us, but we have somebody who is at least signed in, who has worked on the transnational paths of modernism, including Pakistani and Indian artists who went to Slovakia, who went to other spaces in Central and Eastern Europe. I don't know if she's still with us, but it would be interesting to get her also into the discussion if she's willing. Yes, she's here. Okay. Simona, may I invite you? Okay. How do I put her mic on? Can somebody help me?
Yeah, the more the merrier. I mean, I have a ton of not a ton. I have some number of students who are navigating this domain of global modernisms. And I find the linguistic frames, so refreshing. So in Turkey, for example, in Republican Turkey, the word for influence, tezir, is the same as the word for impression. So the impressionists, so named, become translated as influencers that we should take up, because artists take up influences, and that's a good thing. We need to have this impression of the impressionists, right? So I love these linguistic contexts that completely diffuse the toxic belatedness, that most art history brings, and the guilt and the shame, we're post-Cubist. Well, yeah, we're all post-Cubist. What does that even mean? Anyway, so I love these new forms of research.
Okay, I think Simone is now a panelist. Simone?
That's how quick it goes. Hi, nice to see you, Noit. Caroline Jones, very nice. Thank you for this very refreshing interpretation of Sardican's work. I personally have not worked on Sardican, but I know the context. I know Iftikhar's book, of course. Perhaps I would like to revisit Paris at the time that Sardican was there, because I think that's important to acknowledge that Paris at that time was a very contested place, right, in terms of style. And you have, all three of you talked about this, very important, I think. Sardican was a very lonely figure. I mean, he was not attached or involved or interested in any institutional configuration while in Paris, and it's the same situation back in Pakistan. But in Paris at that time, when Sardican was there were lots of South Asian artists. There were artists from all over the world. I mean, Paris was always a crowded place, it seems. And I think the fact that those artists, and probably we will not be able to include Sardican, were involved in these discussions about, the real or not the real, or the abstract, or where does modernism go? I mean, if we look at the École de Paris, I think it's a good example. École de Paris played a large part in those early positions of the Biennale also. So I would be interested in also bringing that into the conversation. I think that's really important. I'm thinking of Krishna Reddy, who was a formative player in the Atelier 17, Stanley William Hayter's plays. There were lots of other artists to name from South Asia who were instrumental in formulating, co-contributing to what modernism is in these years. And I think perhaps, if we look at that, and then why was Sardican not involved in any of that? Makes it almost sound as if it passed by, or, it just happened. And I think he was picked for the Biennale really solidly on that figure that you exclusively talked about, the diplomat, right? So, the official Pakistan at that time, which was West and East Pakistan, decided for other artists to send on official tours, which was not Sardican. So, that's my thoughts for the time being.
So much complexity. Thank you for interjecting that. I would only allude to Alex Albero's book, Abstraction in Reverse, which is about the Latin Americans who were hugely influential on the Paris scene, right? With the Grave and so on. So we know some things about that moment and the importance of internationals in defining that moment. But I'm not aware of any monographs that capture the South Asian energies. I think London, we need those histories as well. I've been trying to get a dissertant to look at Signals Gallery. I think that's fascinating, right? So I totally accept the premise of what you're saying. I don't fully understand and would love to have you explain the difference between the official Pakistani travel grants and this lonely Sardican. Sardican's loneliness is somehow produced by this artist who obsesses about Picasso but never mentions the name Chugtai, right? Or never mentions the name of the very major calligraphic modernists, who are circulating right, in his world, right? So we have anxieties of influence. We have the production of loneliness as a protective, apparatus of originality is one possibility.
I mean, Chuktai was something else. I mean, that Chuktai was very rooted in South Asian painting tradition, the Persianate version of that, right? So I think that
all I'm saying is it's never mentioned by Sadeghian. It's never mentioned by the historians of Sadeghian, but it feels like you would be dealing with it if you were making those paintings. So I didn't show the late Sadeghian works where he takes on Quranic scripture. He takes on, in these giant canvases with sort of like there's a boat, and then the boat has on the deck a verse of the Quran. They're really odd, and I just have not known anyone to take on the complex of calligraphic modernism the way Dadi has. But Dadi, you have to pick and choose. Dadi picks and chooses, so he's all focused on the rubaiyat and these published poetic works. He's not dealing with the problematic of when calligraphy becomes expanded to a canvas so much and then circulates. Yeah, I mean, he does a little bit. Anyway, it's just something I'm a student of, right? I'm not an author of this material in any mastering way. I'm a student trying to figure this out. And I think it's, really interesting.
Well, what you offered as a methodology, Caroline, is one of collaborative work, right? In which we cannot be masters. I mean, that word itself is a kind of, modernist myth. So how to change that kind of work, that singular, isolated, so-called autonomous work of writing, of researching behind a kind of authorship to a collaborative work, which I thought you offered very nicely.
But I think, and that goes back to that, what you say, Caroline, the curiosity to really, I mean, you always were pleading for, it's always great to find a box that is not open. Don't go to a shelf where 5 books are already written. Take the closed box and then go by yourself and explore. And this notion of exploring and finding out and trying to read something that you don't yet understand because you might be not familiar with the contextuality of that work or like the different positions. I think that is so interesting. And that is, of course, also what made not only required to do collaborative work within your discipline, but maybe art historians have to work with historians or with anthropologists or with other cultural practitioners to have a different understanding of the reading. And my senior colleague here, like one of the eminent art historians, T.K. Sabapathy, he always said we have to understand the history more as a geocultural challenge. Like to really understand how regions are functioning and then how they are changing. And for me, it was really stunning when we were working on a book on different spaces that had a strong influence in the lack of institutions here in Southeast Asia. We came also, of course, across Patrick Flores, my colleague from the Philippines, wrote about, of course, like the artistic movements in the Philippines. And our translator to German, he said, oh, there's a mistake in the translation. We have to look this up because it says Imelda Marcos basically was supporting avant-garde and conceptual art. That cannot be. I mean, there must be something wrong. Like usually a more authoritarian regime is more for realism and is more for the figurative. There must be something wrong. And this is very stunning that basically the wife of the autocratic ruler of the Philippines, Imelda Marcos, was supporting international avant-garde and opened the cultural center of the Philippines, which was at avant-garde. So that is very difficult for us from the West sometimes to understand this different kind of positions. And so I think it does require, as you suggest, much more collaborative work. As Caroline said, like images are missing. There are gaps in the histories. how do we fill those puzzles? And I think this requires really, as in other disciplines, much more collaborative teams. And in humanities, we deal more usually with single authored kind of research, and it's usually even not accepted by academic standards if you work in a group like in natural histories or in STEM science. So I think we really have to also change our methods.
Yeah, I'm all for it. And I actually tried to publish this paper collaboratively, and ultimately my linguistic collaborator, Sarah Rivke, was like, I can't claim your thesis or your I mean, she just wasn't comfortable with it. So it's an interesting problem, and I think I'm grateful to you for raising it. I do want to say about Sadaqain that what a lot of what's emerging now is, very hot memoirs, very like, ooh, and there's a lot of, sort of reflexive rejection because he is very tight with the dictator at a certain point. It's very lovely that he's rescued by the dictator from the Islamicist, censors that would burn his house down, right? I mean, he's not, by being not political, he's consummately political in terms of who his protectors are. And, whoa, I didn't touch any of that, right? Because that is indeed, as you say, something that needs work from a very sensitive, competent cultural historian of deep, the deep complexity of Pakistan, which we're living today with, like, oh, we like the Taliban when they weren't in power, but now that they're in power, it's complicated for us in Pakistan. I mean, it's very hard to follow. And the West, I mean, the US is ignorant on a global stage in this region, right? They're performing their ignorance in cataclysmic loss of life and, military, bad military investments in a putatively democratic, Afghanistan. So yes and yes, these are super complicated. And I have no problem in accepting Ismael de Marcos as a patron of conceptual art. Minimalism totally makes sense to me, right? These are elites. And that's sort of what I was hinting at when I was commenting about something I'm aware of this nostalgia for this period when elites told everybody what to think about politics and culture, and everybody was like, yeah, that's right. I mean, we certainly don't live in that universe now in the US, right? The anti-intellectualism and the anti-elitism is how you get elected and how you shut down your humanities at your university in favor of STEM, and how you get rid of tenure, and how you, right? I mean, so the elites are uniquely embattled at this post-Cold War moment. And so I recognize my own research on the Cold War as a certain kind of nostalgic, as Naeem said, right? When you find a period that seems stable, so you can analyze it, even though, that's a narrative that we have to impose.
But what I think is very interesting also to refer back to Naeem, and it's a pity that he probably is no more here, is
I hope he's sleeping.
He and some of his peers are really looking now back on their own history. So, I mean, Naeem was mentioning the show that we had on the Non-Aligned with John Akomfra, looking at the unfinished story of Stuart Hall, and like, how did the different communities, how did different geographies basically experience this period? Like we see it a lot from our perspective, but how was it experienced basically from artists, intellectuals, and so coming from these other geographies? And as we said, Rashid Areen felt deeply excluded and ignored in his practice that he considered a Western practice, but he was not allowed into the kind of like the ring, so to speak. And only recently he was acknowledged with a participation in Documenta, and at very late age. And I think this is very interesting to really up who owns those histories and who is accepted have access and who is not. And I think it's really interesting, Caroline, to have you also looking into this, and that it's again not just, it cannot be owned just by a region to look into certain practices. We need this kind of like dialogue across the complexities of those also political histories, to understand the complexities also of the cultural histories and how they intersect and diverge.
Yeah, so in terms of how academia organizes itself, I have definitely resisted the area studies model, migrating the area studies model, which is a Cold War model.
Exactly.
I've resisted migrating that into the present. So if the appellation of contemporary art is useful at all, it is useful to break up those old modes by which your China hand understood China, or your Middle Eastern guy, So I have worked to loosen that up, but I think it has to be done with great humility.
I mean, I don't want to speak for Naeem, as I won't, but there is, what he was raising as in Search for the Blind Spots of History are also the moments in which there are no images.
Right.
Right, the moments with which there is no representation, in which you can worm in through a different kind of entry point or method, and I think that's really fascinating as well. But not everything is visualized or represented, and this is also
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But he also pointed to the freedom that the artist has here. He said, like, this allows the space for imagination where he can fill it in. I think for art historian, it would be much more difficult to defend the allowing the space of imagination, because immediately, Caroline, as you say, they will ask for evidence or like the provenience. And so I think even the collaboration, I think, between art historians and artists can be a very fruitful one, because only if you imagine something, you might come to the point. It might be wrong, it might be right, but you at least imagine what was in that space that is empty. What is this gap? And I mean, for example, the secession in Vienna, when they did a book about their history, they figured out in their archives is nothing during the Nazi time, the fascist period. And then they decided to leave it blank. I mean, so they left it blank for what? So I think it is very interesting to deal with these blind spots. But again, I think that it's very important to say, why should an art historian not have an imagination? Because they also have a toolkit to fill this. They can look into form, they can look into style, and then they can follow traces, as you did, Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something like Giacometti is not mentioned in any of the writing so far about Sadikane at the time or now. But my brain has fossilized Giacometti, and, I kind of read that out onto Sadikane, right? So I think it's important to have this imagination, but also to say you can't certify it. So one of the reasons Picasso is so powerful is that he arranged himself for art history, right? He never threw a scrap of paper away. So you can see the moment, I think it's 1906, where he visits Elie Nodelman's studio in Paris and comes back and redraws Nodelman, processing it for himself. And then it comes out in his painting. And it's like, the master has taken up Nodelman and, tamed this provincial American immigrant, artist and become Picasso, right? So he feeds the appetite for archival traces, by art history. So with someone like Sadikane, we have a completely tortured oeuvre, which is being magically resupplied, right? So that is a very different problem. And I think what, to your point, Uta, about the fragmentary nature of the non-Western archive, I mean, this is this was one of the things that Sarah Rivke contributed deeply to this study. She said, acknowledge that the non-Western is always partially produced as non-Western by this complete absence of institutional archive or institutional memory or trace, or, we'll get 1 million more dissertations on MoMA, because they have really good archives. They've digitized a lot of it, right? We'll keep getting dissertations on MoMA. But what about Signals Gallery? Has anybody even gone in to create an archive? Please, someone in London. So these are real problems that beset us. And I guess to Naeem's love for the blind spot of history, part of the art historian would say, like, well, did it happen? Did it mean anything to anyone? This is always the historian's puzzle. You can find a trace of something, but how can you determine its significance until it's passed on, until it's copied, until it's appropriated, until it shows up in a diary, until it is reviewed in a journal, right? So I'm a historian and I love the archive. So laying my hands on that bizarre Pétainiste journal, that was joy, to see the neurotic housewife, right? To see the context was just crazy. Like, you should worry about the neurotic housewife even as you're learning about a Pakistani painter. It's just, like, what do we do with that? It's so fabulous. So I do love the archive. And while the artist may have space to go into a parafictional absence, I think for me, the archive is still pretty important to trace maybe what mattered, maybe who saw something, maybe if something became public or entered the public sphere. So I still, I'm still going to focus a little bit on what traces remain.
And I think, as you also say, you encourage your students to look into certain direction, or like look up something in particular. And I think universities can play a very important role, really supporting scholarship in this direction. And it does happen increasingly, I have to say, but for me, it was fascinating being here now to meet young scholars who, like, for example, there is a new journal called Southeast of Now, of young art historians who are either trained in the region or who are researching on the region here. And they avoid, for example, the notion of Southeast Asia. They say Southeast of Now. So, and already like problematizing the term. And it's really interesting to see where they're going. They're around like 30, like plus. And they're not nostalgic at all, but they run with a huge curiosity into those kind of like blind spots and looking them up. And that is for me very fascinating to have like students who, for me, is a complete revelation. And as I said, like one of my PhD students is studying the MoMA archive and MoMA's relationship to Southeast Asia in the Cold War, which I pointed out to Ken, as I said, like, you should have her speaking. She is the one who knows this all, not me. And so I think there is a big potential, and I really think it's fantastic that the Hong Kong, the Baptist University, dedicates so much time to this very important period that has such implications today. So I think it's interesting. And then for me, it was, as I said, coming more from curatorial practice, it was very interesting to see the role of the institution. But I think we need, of course, to fill it with research about the art in the institution, as you do, Carrie, and your students. And I think what is very important in this Cold War scenario, to look up also towards the East. The role of the Japan Foundation, for example. How did Japan try to position itself after a lost war? How did
Japan, or the Japanese department stores, which were where art was being shown. Like we don't, we don't even understand that context, in the US. So one of the challenges for the young scholars of today, I'm certainly in the non-Western context, is they have to build their own archive. So one brilliant student basically left Syria with her archive on various, zip drives, practically like sewn into her clothing. And that is, the last time she could do that research for decades. So under beds, on top of refrigerators, in the back of closets, these archives are hauled out. They're photographed by the scholar with some cell phone on the top of the bed, and then you take it with you, and that's what you've got. So the archive has to be built. The archive has to be, and that's a very heavy responsibility, because it's bizarre that you're building an archive that you're then interpreting, right? But that's where we are. Like so many of these projects involve the historian as themselves an institution, right? So it's a heavy charge, because you are the canonizer. You are beginning that work of creating a historical canon for a specific place and time. So the students that I've been referencing, Annika Lenson, Sarah Rifke, Karen Wen, who worked with you, Uta, they build their archive from oral histories. They build their archives from, of course, institutions. Karen worked on CAFA, during the reform period. And much of their argument is then contextualized in a comparative frame. What does it mean in Karen Wen's work when the centralized institution, the equivalent of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the centralized national art institution, is where the avant-garde impulses are being nurtured? So that confronts the entire modernist narrative of being the avant-garde is outside the academy, right? The avant-garde is in the academy, right? So these are super important checks on the presumptions of a Western historical narrative that, I'm really privileged to have learned so much from these researches.
And we have actually, it's interesting to articulate this, how archives have a different history in each one of these spaces, including in Hong Kong, of course, where we have the Asia Art Archive. I wish we had one of the representatives here now, but the importance of the Asia Art Archive. Well, for example, we've had scholars today from the so-called former East talking about institutional representations of certain artists, which of course kind of aligned with party politics, but then the whole range of other archives, of oral testimony or self-historicization as an archive, Julius Köhler, for example, in Slovakia, or Artpool, the work that Artpool is doing in Budapest, incredibly important in assembling all the personal materials of these artists who never made it to the official kind of archive of the party, right, under conditions of normalization. So it's really interesting to trace these movements around and through official archives, to unofficial archives, to kitchen archives in the case of the Soviet Union, right? We have a whole other kind of the different kinds of spaces and epistemologies of what knowledge was and where it was created and by whom.
Yeah.
No, that is also why when we started to look into the art history here of the region, as I said, TK Sabapasi, he is on this. It's now 7 years that we supported him in National Gallery on a book on the modern in Southeast Asia and what is the modern and the asynchronicity of the modern. He said in each country, he asked always everybody, when did in your country the modern begin? Cambodia, Vietnam, when do you think there is the modern? And it's Caroline, as you say, a lot of these articles then about this kind of modern art history and artists, it occurred on lifestyle magazines, like women magazines or so, because there was no infrastructure. So you have to really dig and find it. And I think that is, for me, so fascinating being here. It's not prepared in your Wiesner library at Harvard or so. You really have to dig, as you said, Caroline, in the private archives. But for example, also Kunchi in Yogyakarta, which is a self-organized group by artists and young art historians, cultural practitioners, is an amazing archive. And they put it all together and they put workshops up. The Visual Art Archive, which was put together also in Jogja by Farah Vardani and her peers, you know, and these are not small archives, they are huge, but we don't hear about them because they're not in a university context, they're not in a museum context. They're run by practitioners based on their own money or some donations, by their commitment, because there is otherwise, they know it's getting lost.
Yeah, that's very moving.
We have about 10 minutes left before we're calling it a night or a day or an afternoon. So I just want to invite anybody who still wants to ask a question or to participate in the discussion to please, this is your chance.
Can I comment from another side of the Cold War X screen?
Please.
Namely, thank you. It's a fascinating conversation that we are privileged to listen between you. And, it's funny, but look, the first Russian avant-garde exhibition was shipped to United States as early as 1924, organized for the first and for the last time by the artists themselves. Most of them did not return to the Soviet Union for apparent reasons. And then if you look forward further, you see, I can say that a single person, like an artist who worked for South Tajiki expedition and in North Circassia town of Nukus, he came to the party boss and said, you know, man, you have such a nice town and you have a palace of culture, but it is empty. Give it to me and I'll make a museum of your national history. I know how to take all these kumgans and you'll have a wonderful historical museum in Uzbekistan no one has. And the guy said, well, okay, but you must appoint me a director of an art history museum, Kunsthalle. He said, okay. And having implemented this archaeological part of his life, because, and that took away his life very early because he dissolved the dirty copper vessels in formalin and inhaled a lot of things, so his lungs went away. But before that, he went to collect the best collection of avant-garde that nobody wanted. So he took from the families, like later the Greek mecenate, you know, did the same after 1976. He took all the papers, all the notes, everything that the family wanted to discard because the artist is gone, the pictures are there. So he grabbed everything. When he had no money, he gave receipts. He had, for $4 billion, he made receipts to the families before he died. But he also went to provincial museums, to the back storages, and told them, you know, you have all this shitty avant-garde stuff. You will never exhibit it. And said, of course not. You can send it to my state museum in Nukus by transfer. And I will carry them and put in my deposits, and you would be free to get new socialist realism art that you don't have place to put in. So that brought another collection. And then there were unofficial things, and it takes usually one enthusiast, a person. There is a huge volume on avant-garde done by a woman, and a single woman, and she titled it, "Could really anyone remember that we lived?" And these were the forgotten artists of a variety of streaks. So within the domain of politicized art that is catered by the Union of Artists, when artists got these orders and were doing official things, they did unofficial things as well. If you take the guy who painted Brezhnev, like Nalbandian, he did wonderful watercolors and he did nice semi-avant-garde things. So it is very difficult to detach the official art and the non-official art. And my question to you today would be on a different streak. you know, in the last decade, the world has entirely changed. When you click at any picture by any artist, on the right corner of your screen, you'll get millions, thousands of similar images aggregated by artificial intelligence on recognizing the images. That is something horrible for an artist, because to become original and to see that this and that and all other things have already been painted by millions of people, let's say 70% of them are less than mediocre. But the rest, and how you can discriminate between good art and non-art source, fake art, quasi-art. I wonder whether we are now not in a multicultural state, not in terms of political multiculturalism, but in terms of having the nexus between East and West, between different countries or between different artists from different parts of the world, that put a possibility to be influenced by another person. So, and that relates not only to the painting, which I love, or to the graphics, but also to music, also to performative arts, etc., etc., etc. So, in my opinion, we now live in a very tough multicultural world. Would you agree to that, Caroline? And then no. And then, what do you think?
I live in the land of algorithms. I work in the land of algorithms. So, a couple of just brief comments.
Mm-hmm.
You see the 1,000 images that are filtered for your location and your language group and your previous searches. So don't be under the illusion that you're seeing everything. That's comment one. Comment two, of course, I was fantasizing that we could easily make a machine learning tool that would bridge the blind spots in the archive. You just interpolate, you project, oh, well, this is like that. We can hybridize them in the middle, right? So yeah, it's a brave new world. But I want to anchor us back to these institutions, because it was beautiful of you to bring up Nukus. By some strange twist of fate, I was able to go to that museum with one of my non-Western modernist graduate students who forced us to leave, I don't know, Samarkand on a van and trundle out there. And it was difficult to see the little Popova and the beautiful Uzbek modernist portrait, because the girls were all out picking cotton. So the Soviet monoculture that has drained the lake has also drained the institution of its potential curatorial apprentices. So, part of my perspective is that we never want to imagine in our intellectual histories that we are free from these ground conditions, right? So the harvesting of the monocultural cotton to provide cash crops for this dictatorial state puts the Nukus experiment into precarity. So I'm not so much besotted by the contemporary multicultural Bilderflut, the image flood, as I am always depressed and humbled by, human extractivism and the peril in which it puts everyday culture. So the Nukus Museum could burn up tomorrow with the climate changed, lake drained situation of that corner of Uzbekistan, Anyway, that's a depressive note. Let us be more upbeat and say that by making meaning out of these moments of the past, and I'm still fascinated by this 1924 shipment of a Soviet avant-garde exhibition. I hope you'll tell me in the chat where that was and what that was. I want to know more about that. I think these moments of the past are gems that we can polish and open out to examine our present. So the fact that we can be together in 15 time zones in a virtual world, is not a depressive part of our digital condition. That's actually a gift. So, but do not take the algorithm as neutral. So if you really want to see the billion images, you have to rewrite the algorithm so that you can harvest them from, the Chinese Google that is firewalled against certain Western searches, and the Western Google that is probably filtering out certain things they call pornography, and the Russian, whatever the equivalent of Google is, that is probably filtering out any information about, I don't know, Putin. So just do not assume that globalism is a smooth terrain. It is lumpy. It is full of corporate and proprietary frictions. And, the Cold War was the period where we could rip off any Russian music because we didn't honor their copyright conventions. Right? So there are lots of things to think about. And I'm so grateful to you all for pitching these questions into the mix.
Thank you so much. This is my time to thank everybody who has been with us all day, participating, listening, contributing, writing, thinking, and immediately also to Professor Caroline Jones and Uta Mehta Bauer for really helping us kind of finish the evening with new Plural Histories and New Imaginaries. We will reconvene tomorrow at 8 a.m., where we will continue with a panel on humanity, ecology, and trauma. So we are moving right along to other archaeologies of the Cold War and of the present. So again, thank you all very, very much for contributing to this event from all the corners of the world. And thank you for the amazing discussion, Caroline Jones and Uta Mehta Bauer. Thank you very much.
So wonderful to see you guys. Bye-bye.
I have to say the same. This is a blessing. Thanks so much.
Next time in person.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
All the best. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Nice to meet you virtually. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye, Noit. Bye, Carrie.